Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. JD Vance's ambush was successful. The Vice President got what he wanted.
Very often it's repeating the same old slogans. In the Ukraine context, well, this is a war of democracy against tyranny. Well, that's like a very simplistic way, of course, to think about it.
You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
I certainly admire the Ukrainians who are fighting against Russia, but I do not think that it is in America's interest to continue to fund a effectively never-ending war in Ukraine.
A few days after the humiliating public betrayal of Ukraine by Donald Trump and Vance in the Oval Office, the US government paused all aid to its ally.
Because I have to know that they want to settle. I don't know that they want to settle.
Now, President Zelensky faces a terrible dilemma. Ukraine relies on American support, on the aid, military equipment and intelligence that only the United States has been able to provide. So, in the immediate term, he has no real choice but to work with an administration that is trying to bully him into an unacceptable ceasefire while courting Russia on the side.
I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine.
Do you, Mr. President, think that Vladimir Putin is taking advantage of the U.S. pause right now on intelligence and military aid to Ukraine?
No, I actually think he's doing what anybody else would do.
Europe, meanwhile, is realigning itself in response to this new reality. The United States' traditional allies are scrambling to adapt. To reflect on what all of this means, and particularly on its immediate impact on Ukraine, we're joined this week by His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko, Ambassador of Ukraine to Australia. We spoke about his personal experiences of the war, what Putin wants, Australia's role in supporting Ukraine, and why Ukrainian and European security matters to America. Here he is now. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
No, happy to be with you.
Thank you. Ambassador, I wanted to start with the premise that, as you would know, of course, analysis of international relations and foreign policy often treats war and negotiations as a kind of big strategy game, men having meetings in Oval Offices. But it's not a game. It has real consequences. So I wanted to start by asking you if you could describe for our listeners what this invasion has done to the lives of Ukrainians.
I think it's important to go back to basics and look to what has happened during the past 11 years, because Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, grabbed Crimea, intervened in the east of Ukraine, killed 38 Australians on board of an MH17 flight, as many other innocent passengers on that flight on the 17th of July. And Russia felt emboldened by what they've done. And the reason they were emboldened because the reaction of the free world was very weak to that invasion. And they beefed up their military. Thanks to the increasing prices for oil and other commodities, they have been able to invest lots of money into their military and their other capabilities. And in 2022, Russians felt like they could do it, and they wanted to take over entire Ukraine. And we know what happened, right? They came over from 3 different sides, and I was still in Kyiv when it all happened with my family, my 5-year-old son, my 18-year-old daughter, and being there in an apartment, hearing explosions and reading online 5 o'clock in the morning that Russian paratroopers are landing literally 20 minutes from where I live. And this is one of those moments which I will never be able to forget, because that's one of those moments when you get that fear and fear for the safety of your family. And I wish not a single Australian will ever experience that, because that's a gut-wrenching experience. Because we don't care about ourselves individually, usually, but we care about our loved ones, about your family. And that was that moment when I was in that mode, and it was like, oh, we need to get out of the city. And I was not the only one. Another million people wanted to leave the city, but it was difficult to leave the city. We got stuck. I mean, the traffic was huge, and the petrol stations have run out of fuel. And it took us 2 days, actually, to get out of the city. And we eventually made it to my hometown in Western Ukraine. Several days later, I took my family to Romania because they didn't feel safe in Ukraine. They became refugees, basically, and I stayed behind and did what I could do. But I was in the middle of my appointment to come as an ambassador to Australia at the time. I wasn't sure it was going to go through, because it was really, as you remember, those first several weeks, it was really uncertain what was going to happen. But then President Zelensky has issued a decree. I was already halfway. We already had an approval of the Australian government for my appointment. And I got appointed in mid-March and came to Australia end of March of 2022.
Yeah, wow, what an extraordinary journey. Ambassador, you mentioned that Putin was emboldened by the lack of a response in 2014. What do you think he ultimately wants from Ukraine and from this invasion?
Oh, he wants to take over Ukraine entirely. I mean, that's his plan. That was his original plan for a long time. He wants Ukraine failed, and then he wants to take over Ukraine. I mean, that's his goal. And he will not give up. You have to understand those just motivation for Russia and what they do. They want to revive an empire. They want to revive a big Russia kind of concept, Ruski Mir, as they call it, but it goes beyond that, right? That was kind of regaining the status that the Soviet Union had at the height of the Cold War, in a way, where Soviet Union was kind of feared and respected. And this is what Putin's pitch to the people. Ukraine, Russia will be great again, and everybody will have to talk to us as equals. And but if you look at Russia, I mean, this is all. I mean, Russian economy is the size of the economy of Italy, or one country in Europe. It's a dwarf on the economic map of the world. If it was not for the oil and nuclear weapons, and nobody would even pay attention to Russia. It would be just one of those regional countries who may be a regional power, but certainly not a global power. That's for sure.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and of course, nuclear weapons have I suppose tempered and informed the response from Europe. And you mentioned, of course, the lack of reaction, or the muted reaction, I suppose, in 2014 of the free world. How much do you think Europe's response has changed over time, and how important are the steps that Europe is now taking to support resistance?
I think there was a fundamental moment 3 years ago when President Zelensky got his phone out and recorded a message: "I'm here, my team is here, and we're here to fight."
With danger all around, reports emerged the Americans had offered an evacuation, to which Mr. Zelensky replied, "I need ammunition, not a ride."
Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні.
And Ukrainian people were united as never before. And I think that was a big surprise to Vladimir Putin. Also, he was very much surprised by the international coalition of countries who came to support Ukraine. American president, prime minister from Britain, they've driven that process. They rallied a coalition of 50 nations in support of Ukraine, including Australia. And everybody got in, and they just started providing assistance to Ukraine, military assistance, financial assistance, humanitarian assistance. And of course, it was all gradual in a way. As you remember, Germany initially was just providing us with blankets and helmets. That was their intention. While today, Germany is number 2 country in the world in terms of military equipment provided to Ukraine. I mean, that must have been a huge shift, right? This Zeitenwende, which has been described kind of a big, huge foreign policy change. And that also applies to many other countries as well, because it was all about what the platforms were released. But initially, as you know, it was actually under the first Trump administration, we were able to get javelins. And several months before the war, Brits have provided like 2,000 of NLAWs. Those are anti-tank missiles. And those, javelins and NLAWs were fundamental in our ability to stop the tanks rolling into Ukraine. Because you remember the huge 60-kilometer convoy of military convoy from Russia that got stuck. A lot of that we were able to stop it by using those anti-tank missiles which were initially provided. So that support was important, and then it was gradually just growing. Right, we got artillery, we got air defense systems, we got multiple rocket launchers, and we got some other like long-range capabilities, and then we got tanks. So, I mean, different kind of platforms were released gradually, and certainly they were released, and we wouldn't be able to defend ourselves without that support. But we were just getting enough not to be defeated. We never kind of got enough to kind of prevail. I mean, for the reasons you've described in your question. And we now know for a fact that there was a reasoning behind that. And, 3 years later, and in 2022, there was that moment when we felt like, wow, because our counteroffensive in 2022 was very effective. We pushed Russians out from Kharkiv, we pushed Russians out of Kherson, and we managed to regain a great deal of territory that the Russians have originally occupied. But then there was a pause. It was winter, we didn't have the equipment. And then 9 months later, we did a counteroffensive in 2023, and it just failed. It failed for several different reasons. We didn't have air superiority. We didn't have the jets, and Russians were dominating the air. Russians have built all the 3 lines of defense, and heavily mined, and basically not a single country could have ever broken that lines of defense without having air support and having air superiority and having actually modern approach to the warfare. But I think even the most experienced armies would be boggled down there.
Not a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
you
and
haven't
not
been
only
alone.
in this cabinet.
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion.
You voted
we gave
for
you
your
military
president.
equipment,
You
and you
voted
men
for
are
your
brave,
president.
but they had to use our military.
What about
if you didn't have
You
our
invited
military
me.
equipment,
You invited
if
me
you
to
didn't
speak.
have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days, this is something
Maybe
new.
less.
If it's all right, let's talk maybe a little bit more about American support and the United States' role in this conflict, because of course I can't not ask you what your reaction was to that meeting between President Zelensky and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
Yeah, certainly. America is the biggest supporter of Ukraine, and America has been a beacon of democracy globally. And I admire America personally. I will be happy to speak about my personal experience of America later on. But now I would like to focus on their contribution. Certainly, we wouldn't be able to survive without American support. That's clear. As you know, European Union has been actually, in terms of numbers and money, European Union provided more than the US. I think it's 139 billion euros, right, as a union. And also, if you add Europe and you add Britain, Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, and others, so Europe overall probably provided maybe 65% of assistance. Numbers can differ, but American contribution was still huge, right? We wouldn't be able to withstand. Plus, let's face it, even a lot of this European money was used to buy American weapons, because American defense industry is most developed, the biggest industry in the world in terms of the ammunition, in terms of HIMARS, Patriot systems, just one Patriot systems. This is the only air defense system which we have, which can intercept ballistic missiles. And, and as you know, Russians use ballistic missiles on the regular basis against Ukraine. And missiles for those air defense systems are vital for our survival. So American support has been huge. We are extremely grateful. Every Ukrainian is extremely grateful. And, people go to churches, they pray for America, they pray for American president, they pray for, it doesn't matter who's the president. You have to understand that that's a matter of our survival. And without America, wouldn't be able to do it. And the problem is that without America, Europe would not be able to do it. It takes two to tango. And it's been transatlantic relations since 1949, which was a backbone of security in Europe. And there's no alternative. Of course, we can talk about what is happening now, but for the time being, it's what Russia is trying to do is to distance Europe from America. And we need to prevent it. And this is not the first time Russia is doing it. They've done it before. They want to actually create a rift between America and Europe. And that's very dangerous. For that matter, China is interested in the same thing. And therefore, it's so important to maintain the transatlantic partnership. And I have to say, make a disclaimer, I'm an alumnus of the Marshall Memorial Fellowship, a program by the German Marshall Fund, which is a leadership program. And in 2019, 2018, I traveled on that leadership program to the US. Ukraine was included just several years before that, because previously it was only for the kind of NATO members. But then it was expanded to other countries like Austria and Sweden. At the time, Ukraine was included as well. And I spent 3 weeks on a program in the US while Americans were in Europe. I was with the Europeans there. And that was all about transatlantic connections, both on business, government, NGOs, and different sectors. At that time, I was actually in the private sector. I was in business and kind of involved in civil society. And that was a transformational experience for me as well, though it was my probably 15th time in America. So I know America really well. It was not the first time I was there. But at the same time, that was GMF has really taught me the history of that and how important it is. It was founded by Germany in the early 70s to thank American government for support in the Marshall Plan of rebuild of Germany after war. So for me, a transatlantic partnership is more than just a talk. By the way, President Macron did this program in 2006, I believe, and he's probably the most prominent alumnus of that leadership program.
I think that's just such a beautiful example of the human relationships that develop between allies that often get lost when we focus so much, just on presidential relations, for example. But Ambassador, you mentioned there your deeper personal connection with America. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
For me, I got fascinated with America when I was a kid. I was born in 1981, so my first 10 years was still in the Soviet Union, but it then collapsed. So I don't really remember much of Soviet Union when I was just a kid. But in the early 90s, Ukraine was extremely poor, going through transformation. And I lived in a small rural town in the family of medical doctors. But we got these American shows in those days, and that was an American show called Beverly Hills. You probably wouldn't remember it, but it was massive. It was huge. All the kids were watching it. And I was 13, I believe, and I was fascinated about the life of young people in California. And I got so interested. And then I met somebody who was actually on her way to the US on a high school exchange program. And I learned about that high school exchange program. And that was funded by the US government, by the State Department. It's called Future Leaders Exchange. And I got so interested. And I started learning English basically like there is no tomorrow. I spent 10 hours per day during my summer holidays, focusing on my English. And because I really wanted, because it was a competition, very selective competition. And I got into the competition, I won it. And at the age of 15, I went to America. And I lived in Tennessee with a Pentecostal family for a year. So I went to a Pentecostal church. I heard people speak tongues in the church. I went to a Sunday Bible school, and I'm a Greek Catholic, for that matter. But it was just, for me, experiencing that Bible Belt of America was phenomenal. I lived in Chattanooga, which was on the border with Georgia and Alabama. I mean, that was like my life-changing experience. And I came back. I still had 1 year of school to go. I went to university in Kiev. And at the age of 18, I started a 2-year internship at the U.S. Embassy. So I was an intern there for 2 years. I was involved in public affairs and culture and press. But I was a volunteer. I wasn't get paid, but I had a chance to work on a visit of President Bill Clinton to Ukraine in the year 2000, right? He did a big speech at St. Michael Square in Ukraine, addressing the nation and citing our Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko, where he said, "Borітеся, поборете," which means fight and you will prevail. And that was a lines from the famous Ukrainian poet. And I was 19 at that time. And later on, I went to America to study at a summer business school at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania for a summer. Later on, I was visiting America many times. I studied lobbying at American University on a 2-week course there. I traveled in California. I took my family to Florida. I actually once worked with some farmers who were my clients, went to Fargo, North Dakota to buy some grain storage facilities. So I spent like a whole week at a farm show, exploring North Dakota, buying American equipment for the Ukrainian farmers. And I already shared my experience about GMF, which I did more recently. And look, so my experience of America is very diverse, but it's now I'm 43 now. So I started at 15, so I really know America really well, the history, the culture, the people. And you know what makes you so different from America, Australia and America? Americans had to fight for their freedom. You didn't. Brits didn't. Britain was an empire. But Americans had to fight for their independence, for their freedom. And this is what makes us very aligned. Ukrainians are fighting for the freedom, for independence. And this is why Americans were so supportive, remain so supportive of Ukraine, because this is our freedom war. This is a war they had to fight in the 18th century to become independent. And many countries helped them. We don't know what if France did not help America, where they would be. Would they succeed or not? And I think this is a very important lesson today for America to stay in. Look, the only time Article 5 was used was after 9/11. By the way, I was in New York just a month before that, and I was on top of Empire State Building seeing those Twin Towers. And I came back a year later, they were gone. And that was the time when Article 5 was used, and all the countries have support, including Ukraine, by the way. We sent our troops to Iraq, we sent our troops to Afghanistan, all upon America's help. That's the reason why Americans are supporting us and should continue supporting us and Europe. As you know, we've given up our nuclear weapons upon the assistance of American president. An American president put a signature there on that document that our security and territorial integrity and sovereignty will be respected, along with the president of Russia, France, Britain, and China. And we want that document to be respected, that we signed in 1994 in Budapest. It must be respected because Ukraine and Kazakhstan is the only countries in the world which have given up nuclear weapons voluntarily, right? Nobody ever done it. So what we see now, we really have stopped nuclear non-proliferation because other countries now paying attention to what is happening and figuring, well, maybe we need nuclear weapons as a deterrent. So if we get more nuclear weapons, where are we going? I mean, what's the danger of the destruction of the world? Very high, because if more countries have nuclear weapons, the more dangerous it becomes. So we are in a very dangerous situation currently, and certainly nobody wants to have a World War III. However, we need to make sure that, aggression is not rewarded, that aggressors are kept accountable for the act of aggression, for war crimes, for crimes against humanity, for all of that, whatever Russians have done, they cannot go unpunished.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless.
You don't know
God
that.
bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem.
I'm really interested in your point about China and Russia in particular having an interest in dividing the United States and Europe, because there's also clearly a view in the Trump administration that it can step away from Europe and focus its resources and its attention on competing with China. But you've just alluded to, and President Zelensky alluded to in that meeting in the White House, this idea that America would also be affected by a failed ceasefire in Ukraine, is also affected by instability and insecurity in Europe. So, you've spoken about why the United States is so important to Ukrainian and European security. But why then is Ukrainian and European security also important for the United States? Why is that in the United States' interest as well?
Oh, absolutely. Look, and it's more than that. We just go global, because if an aggressor could be rewarded for the invasion, for what Russia has done, that will embolden other authoritarian leaders, right? This is as simple as that. Very simple message. It's a nuclear power, permanent member of the UN Security Council, a dictatorship. Russia decides to destroy a democracy next door. Firstly, they come and invade Georgia in 2008. 6 years later, they come and invade Ukraine. Felt emboldened, come back 8 years later with a mission to complete the job. And now, the 3 years have passed. Enormous destruction, devastation, killing many people in Ukraine, killing many Russians as well. We estimate the Russian casualties now come up to 800,000 people, both killed and wounded on the Russian side. So they clearly have lost more people than us. And, occupying 20% of Ukrainian territory now. Massive gross violations of human rights in the occupied areas. People are detained, they're tortured. They are forced to accept Russian citizenship if they want to get access to any public services. They cannot re-register their private property unless they have a Russian passport. Curriculums in school are totally rewritten. It's now Russian curriculum. They're actually burning Ukrainian books in the libraries there. Just actually like during the Second World War, Nazis were doing it in burning books, actually. This is what we, our people, are going through, right? But Russians have not, progressed that much. We managed to liberate 50% of the territory they occupied. We destroyed 50% of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. They kind of boggled down in the east. They're now gaining ground gradually, but at a huge cost. Daily, they lose about 1,000 people there. Both killed and wounded. We still hold the ground in Kursk. We made an incursion in August of last year as a way to prevent attacks from that territory of Russia against Ukraine. And we're still holding ground there. So which demonstrate that Russia is not so much interested about protecting their own people as they are interested in killing Ukrainians. And this is where we are.
The people of Ukraine have shown courage for 3 years. For 3 years now, they're into their fourth year of a land war in Europe. And this is a struggle not just for the people of Ukraine and their national sovereignty. This is a struggle for the international rule of law.
And you mentioned there quite clearly the importance of the maintenance and the defence of the international rule of law. Here in Australia, the Prime Minister has said that, our Australian support for Ukraine is based on that premise, on Australia's interest in the international rule of law. How critical do you think it is for the United States to continue to support that international rule of law, not just for Ukraine, of course, but for the world?
It is. And look, what's happening in Europe, if European security is undermined, it will have a direct, and it's already having a direct impact on the security in the Indo-Pacific. The deployment of the North Korean troops to Russia, the cooperation that they've had, the defense cooperation that North Koreans and Russians have, cooperation with Iran, right? Russia's allies and friends are rogue states, pretty much. And they are a source of instability in the Middle East with Iran, and of course in the Indo-Pacific in North Korea. If North Koreans are getting support with their missile programs, if North Koreans are getting support with their nuclear programs, and actually North Korea can develop their nuclear capabilities, the question will be what that means for the Korean Peninsula, what that means for a wider security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. And this is a very important question because we already see how it is all intertwined, interconnected, and how the way this war is going to play out will define the security architecture for next decades, actually. And certainly, whether we like it or not, we see that America is changing its role in the world. And it's now up to the world to stand up to democracy. Ukraine is doing that. And we're grateful that for Australia's increasing willingness to do so.
I mean, Ambassador, just on that question of the international rule of law, I think there is great concern internationally about what the Trump administration is doing to undermine the international rule of law. And that's being reflected, I think, in how people are feeling about the United States across the world. So, even before President Zelensky's meeting in the White House, Australia Institute polling showed that 44% of Australians now prefer a more independent foreign policy, and only 35% want a closer alliance with the United States. And there are similar results coming out of Denmark. A recent poll in France came out with a similar result. What's your sense of how the United States' traditional allies and people within those traditional alliances are feeling about the United States and the international rule of law?
Look, I'm an ambassador. I'm not here to talk about the feelings and about public polls, to be frank, because it's not my job. And more so, it's not my job to comment on America, because my job is to comment on Australia and New Zealand, to be frank. I can talk about Ukraine. I certainly have my own opinion and my own views. So I will give you kind of my view of as an ambassador. I think that will be probably the best one, because you can talk to a professor of international law who will give you his view or her view on academic view and as a scientist on this particular issue. Certainly, rules-based international order, general audience don't really understand what it is.
That's true.
I mean, let's face it. I now stopped using it on television because I think people just don't get it. Because look, for a wider audience, I mean, of course, the audience of your podcast, they know what it is. But generally, ask any Australian on the street, do they actually understand what it means? What Australians really understand, and I think this is very clear, there is a bully who wants to destroy somebody who's weak. And that Goliath and David fight, I mean, this is what we are facing, right? So there is evil, there is good. I mean, this is just as simple as that. There is dictatorship, there is democracy. There is a country full of diversity. There is a country which is run by thugs, which is chauvinistic, which is imperialistic. A country which is weaponized Russian Orthodox Church. A country which is weaponized information. A country which is on a mission and it's not only assault on Ukraine, it's assault on democracy globally. Russia, which is trying to undermine democracies. Russia, which is operating in a gray zone, conducting assassinations in Europe, running, special operations. Just even look what Russians have been doing in Europe. So far, the support of Bashar al-Assad in Syria has really delivered lots of good results originally for Russia, not only about supporting a dictator who was friendly to Russia and protecting their military base in the Mediterranean, which they have there, but it was also about that huge number of refugees who had to flee to Europe. And that was something that Russia deliberately pursued, because Russian president knew and knows that those migrants in Europe will actually promote far-right movements in Europe that will strengthen all those far-right parties. And we already see the effect of it. And guess what? In 2022, 6 million Ukrainians come to Europe. That's already contributing to the same trend, because we know reaction to immigration in America, we know reaction to immigration in Europe, we know reaction to immigration in Australia. That's just a global issue, but it has the same response or similar response in different countries for different reasons, of course, and different factors. But the thing is, it is happening, and this is what Russians are pursuing. So, of course, let's get back to rules-based international system. I think sovereignty is a concept which is so important for everybody. That's the reason why United Nations were established. As you know, Ukrainian Socialist Republic was a founding member of the UN. Mm-hmm. We maintained our mission in New York since the day one, since 1944-45, when it was established, along with Belarus and then along with the Soviet Union, right? That was the way it was established. As you know, we question the transfer of the seat on the Security Council as a permanent member from Soviet Union to Russia. It wasn't done legitimately. It was not done legally correct, but that just happened, and we still question that. I don't think it was a legitimate right to do it. But anyways, Ukraine became independent, and Ukraine played a huge role. I mean, not only in founding the UN, but also, being there from day one, having a separate mission. Of course, it was fully dependent on Moscow in those days, but it was still a separate mission. So, by the way, when we established our own foreign ministry in the early 90s, we tapped in that experience for our diplomats, because there were some, Ukrainian diplomats working there in Geneva, in New York, and in other UN agencies, was very important. So we built on that, and we use that experience to build our foreign service. And of course, we don't have any other alternative. There is only one system, which is based on the UN. And for smaller nations here in the region, like New Zealand, all the Pacific Islands, their sovereignty can be only protected by this UN Charter. If UN Charter does not work, if might is right, if we live in the world of a jungle, it's a dangerous world. Because who is right? I mean, who's got nuclear weapons is right. That's it. And who's got bigger military, who has more money. So countries become very vulnerable, and that's a threat for everybody.
Absolutely. And just finally, Ambassador, you mentioned the UN Charter and Ukraine's role in the establishment of the UN. Australia as well, of course, has a long proud history of engagement with the United Nations and the Charter. So I just wanted to ask you finally, what role can countries like Australia, maybe New Zealand as well, play in achieving a lasting peace for Ukraine?
Indeed. And this is what I want to assure you. Ukrainians want peace more than anybody else. We have seen this war for such a long time. But we want to have a sustainable, lasting peace, the peace that will not be broken 4 years from now. Mm-hmm. So to get it, in order to achieve it, we really want to have security guarantees. Because Russians have broken 25 ceasefires since 2014. And we don't trust Russians. Sorry, we just don't trust them. And to be able to create a system which will stop them, we need to create a mechanism of how we can achieve it. We still believe the most viable option would be for us to become a member of NATO, just like Sweden and Finland. They joined NATO very quickly when they saw what Russians did in Ukraine. If we can't join NATO now, though inevitably we will, but for the next 4 years, let's say, we need to build NATO in Ukraine. Strong military, availability of conventional weapons on the territory of Ukraine, which will serve as a deterrent, potentially boots on the ground, like French and and British. We were, very pleased to see that Australia and New Zealand could consider also a deployment. As you know, both Australian and New Zealand Defence Forces are training our soldiers in the UK at the moment, so they're already involved in this particular field. More support. The Bushmaster's been saving many Ukrainians. 120 been supplied so far. Many been destroyed now. There is a request for more Bushmasters to be sent to Ukraine, because we'll need still that military equipment. We'll need that ammunition to serve as a deterrent. Maybe we need to close the sky. We need to have proper air defense. Perhaps British or French Navy in the Black Sea. I mean, it needs to be discussed. We need to see what deterrent we can build against any future Russian invasion. That's one thing. Secondly, we are very much interested in getting investors into the country to rebuild. We are interested in getting investors to develop our critical minerals, our natural resources. We need them. And we welcome that, hope that agreement with America will be signed soon, because we need it. That was our proposal from the very beginning. It's finalized. Both sides are happy with the text. I think And you've seen what President Zelensky said the other day, that he's ready to sign it anytime. And I hope it will be done. But to get investors from America, from Australia, from Europe into Ukraine, we need to have security guarantees. Because I talk to many investors. Why would they invest into a country where Russians can come back and destroy it or capture it? So for us, that security guarantee is fundamental for our rebuild and reconstruction. And so it has to come first. We have to then, rebuild the country. And then once we sign the deal and we have the security guarantees, we'll do the ceasefire. So ceasefire, we want to ceasefire, right? But it has just to happen. And we have to make sure that Russia actually wants to end the war, because we don't see any indication why Russia would stop. And to be frank, we need to understand what is it exactly the leverage is to stop and force Russia to stop in the war, right? We don't see it yet. They feel they are winning, they are on the go, and they are just advancing, right? So we need to make sure we can stop them. So Australia could really make a contribution into defense capabilities of Ukraine, into rebuild, reconstruction. I'm engaging with mining companies in Australia, with different energy companies. There will be lots of opportunities to come and make money in Ukraine. I want Australian companies to make money, because we believe that Australian people and government have been very supportive of Ukraine on both sides of politics, and bipartisan support from the very beginning. And we believe that we have a bright future together, and we're in the same boat, because if we can achieve peace in Ukraine, it'll have a major positive impact in the security here and stability here. And I think it's just the way Australian people have reacted to this war. They will feel proud that they made a contribution. I know many Australians who just want to go and visit Ukraine, to support Ukraine after the war, just as tourists, just come and spend time. Australians love to travel. They go on these long trips because it's so far away that when you go on a trip, you really need to make sure you travel because it's a long flight. So we'll certainly welcome those people there.
And we all hope that's not too far away. So, Ambassador, thank you so much for your time and your generosity.
No, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Emma. And I really enjoyed it.
This episode was recorded on Friday, the 7th of March. No doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. And we'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media. We are at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. And you can send us feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.